Siblinghood, unpacking our relationships and discovering our identity. What do our relationships with our siblings tell us about ourselves? Is there any connection between birth order and our personality traits? If so, what can we learn from this self-discovery, and how can we use the understanding to better interact with our siblings? Here with me today to unpack our sibling dynamic is Marilyn Whitley Carter. Marilyn and I met recently at a graduation ceremony, and as we were conversing about life, I found her self-revelations about her identity as it pertains to the sibling dynamic fascinating. So Marilyn, welcome.
Thank
Thanks for
you,
jumping
Crystal.
on the thanks for jumping on the podcast. Hopefully we can have a repeat of our in-person conversation here on the episode. So first, Marilyn, tell us a little bit more, tell the audience a little bit more about yourself and your family makeup.
Okay, I am one of six siblings. I am number two in the order, number one girl. There are five girls and one boy. The boy is number one. It's interesting when you talk about birth order because I do believe that it's so real and tangible in how we operate. And once we sort of embrace that and don't fight it, then we can kind of accept our roles and accept one another. I do think with me being the number one girl, even though my brother's older, I find I have a lot of those control traits, wanting to tell the siblings what to do because that's what I did growing up. But you realize as you grow into adulthood and they grow into adulthood, the roles have to shift some because you have to respect them as individuals and not necessarily see them as your younger siblings. It's interesting. That's something that I think it hit me with, the number four daughter when she was in college. And I realized I was treating her like she was my younger sister. But at this point in our lives, she was a young adult. And so I would say probably for about maybe since the 90s, since like 92, 93, I've sort of been discovering or rediscovering our roles and how we can interact with one another, how to appreciate my siblings, value what they bring, and not be envious of it because their strengths may not be mine, and then own my strengths and be okay with how we all fit together.
Absolutely. And you really just took the first two questions right out of my mouth just there. I wanted to ask you about birth order and talk a little bit more, though, about it and your recognition of the personality traits for each, if you want to walk us down the line.
Sure. It's interesting because maybe it's because we have one boy and five girls. But with the one boy, he sort of just falls in line when it comes to matters of the family. So anything related to the parents or the other siblings, he sort of defers to me. He will give me his opinion, but typically he'll let me take over and handle things. And of course, I have that internal take charge. I'm the second mother type personality. And it's probably best if I just sort of talk about the five girls because that's where I see the birth order being most dominant in terms of our interactions. So the number two girl, who was the middle child for about 7 years, because there's a gap between the first three girls and the last two. There's like a 9-year gap for me and a 7-year gap for the number three girl. So you got 1, 2, and 3 that were like 63, 64, 65. And then you got 2 that came around in 72. And there's a dynamic there too. But the one that was the 64, which was the middle girl before these last two came in, she is your typical middle child, kind of unsure of where she fits in. She likes to try a lot of different things, but is not really committed to any one.
Mm-hmm.
So the personality is kind of fluid. It depends on who she's with. If she's with me, the older sibling, is one way, the older girl. If she's with that girl that was born in 65, she's a little bit different. She tries to be the leader in their interaction, but she still struggles with that. And that one that was born in 65, which for 7 years was the baby, was sort of followed whatever we said. Growing up, if I was the one who cleaned the house, who prepared the meals, and would do whatever I said, she just sort of fell in line and looked for us to give her direction as to what she needed to do. And she still has a lot of those traits just in her life right now, even at 54, still having some of that dependency, I guess, if you will. And then the last two, they pretty much followed in line. I was the leader, if you will. but they even had very distinct personalities. One being very mild or sort of laid back, and the other being very assertive. So they had their dynamics within the group of five, and then their dynamic with just the two of them. And it's interesting even now to see them interact because I think they respect each other's differences and probably did so sooner than the other three of us. Because as I watched them grow, I didn't see a lot of tension between the two as I saw tension between the first three of us.
Interesting. So you saw more tension with the top half of the birth order than you did the lower half of the birth order.
Exactly. And I don't know if it's because we were close in age and when you sort of get to the point as you're coming into that middle school age where you don't want the older sibling telling you what to do, especially if the older sibling's only a year older than you are.
Hmm.
Who put you in charge? That type of dynamic going on sometimes with the three.
Do you think it had anything to do with jockeying for authority as it pertained to who's going to fill in the role of being second mom, second dad, with the top half of the tension? Did you sense any of that?
I absolutely think that that was the issue because when we were four, that was a different time. It was the 60s, and you always wanted to get the parents' attention. Parents were busy just providing. They weren't helicopter parents like we are today. They were out working and then coming home and taking care of the family. But you always wanted to be noticed. There was so many of you, and I always wanted to be like the second mother. The middle sister, I think she just wanted to play. She just wanted to go out and have fun and didn't want to do chores, only did them because she had to. And heaven forbids if you ask her to cook. That wasn't going to happen. And then that third one was just like, okay, well, I'm just going to do whatever anyone tells me.
Got it. So you also mentioned something during our offline conversation about the personality traits as it pertains to what happens in action.
Hmm.
So you recognize yourself as a doer per
Yes.
se. And then one of the other female siblings was a strategist, is how you put it. So could you talk a little bit more about that dynamic and then if you can identify any more personality traits as it pertains to the five female siblings that you mentioned?
Yes. The two of us used to say that we were Mary and Martha.
From the Bible, Mary and Martha were two women in the
Two
Bible that,
sisters. Yeah.
yep, two sisters. One was the busy bee, always busying around, making sure things were taken care of. And the other were just really sat and was a beer. Basically, just kind of was not necessarily the lazy one,
No. No.
but
Mm-mm.
was just more okay with simply being and existing in her space.
Yes.
And so she wasn't necessarily feel the need to be about busyness.
Yes. And she was always the one who was just curious.
Yes.
She had a curiosity that just needed to be fed. She was always reading and exploring and discovering. So the two of us, I could see, especially the 64 and 63, and I'm doing the numbers just because it's just easier for me. But even now, she's a thinker. You will have discussions, and I can usually come to a resolution on my thoughts pretty quickly. She'll have to sort of think on it for a little bit and let it sit with it. And she's more broader in terms of her approach. And for a number of years, that was something that I envied because I wanted to be a thinker. It's interesting. So the first three have that, and the last two also that have that. You have the oldest that is the thinker, and the others is more of a doer. And so of the five girls, you have two doers and two thinkers, and then the one in the middle, she sort of just meanders and tries to find her place. And she's like a chameleon.
Mm.
She could go either way. She could hang with the first two, or she can be a part of the second two. You still, though, I think, have a bit of competition because one thing I didn't realize when the thinker and I were the one that's closest to me, 64, she said, I've always wanted to be like you. I wanted to do like you do. I want people to like me. I said, we're different. You have strengths that I appreciate and wanted for a long time, but I realized that's not my role. My role is to be the caretaker. Your role is to share knowledge, to be the teacher. And she is very good at teaching. She has a way of disseminating information that anyone can understand. I can learn, but I cannot teach. I can do, but I cannot teach. I think it's only after, or for me, after interacting with so many different women, because I went to a women's college, but so many different women, and seeing so many of my sisters, my birth sisters, and the different personalities that I interacted with, that I could learn to identify and appreciate what the other four brought to the table and step away from being the traditional big sister role and appreciate and value what they bring.
Mm.
That was probably my mid 30s, I would say, before I could acknowledge that needed to be done.
Now, have you, Marilyn, discussed these revelations with your siblings? And if so, do they agree with your conclusions and observations about them?
I have discussed it with number two sibling and with number four sibling. Number three girl sibling and number five, we talk, but interestingly enough, number three, who was the baby for a while, and now she's the middle girl, she's more of a, when you have conversations with her, there's such a neediness that you don't get a lot of back and forth interchange. What you get is a lot of dumping because her personality is such that she's always looking for direction.
Mm,
So our conversations are, well, I should say they are two-way, but it's more of her asking me for advice,
got
more
it.
so than us just sitting. Occasionally we can have conversations about spouses and children, but rarely, because I think she still sees me as the big sister, and I probably with her act more like it. Interestingly enough, about 2 years ago we were together and she was over and her sons were over, and I said something about let them go and do this, and she said, you need to learn how to talk to people. She said, you can't just tell me what to do with my boys. I'm the mother. And I just had to stop for a minute. I said, oh, you're right. You told your son one thing and I told him something totally different. And it just came out. And that's when I realized that it's still in me. As much as I try to acknowledge it, that sisterly control piece is still in me.
Mm,
But with the others, especially the one that's the number two, we have really good conversations about valuing the differences. You know, as you go through different stages in life and you deal with challenges and family and marriages and children, you realize the strength and the value in sitting and having someone to have a confident conversation with that know all of you, and you don't have to use any flowery words. You just speak from your heart. I guess what I wanted them to know is that I learn from them, even though they come to me sometimes for conversation. And I don't want to say advice because I don't think it's advice. I think they just want to talk. But that's an opportunity for me when we have those really life altering situation conversations that we can share with them what I gained from them and what I see as their strengths. And it's really just sort of saying, hey, you have this strength. Sometimes you can't see it, but I can see it.
right. And you mentioned a little bit earlier about through your interactions with various women, in particular at the women's college, and further after that, that you were then able to see some of these universalistic traits or reflections of these things that maybe over the years you didn't really necessarily see as very transparent and maybe just slightly translucent. It was kind of there, kind of clear, but you couldn't really put the pieces together. So, have you noticed a similar narrative in those individuals' lives as it pertains to being able to kind of make these revelations about siblinghood more transparent and clear?
There are probably about three women that I am close to and I have frequent conversations and meetings, dinner with, that also have siblings and mostly girl siblings. And we share traits about our siblings. But what I find the difference between each of the three of them is, when you factor in socioeconomics, I think that has an influence over dynamics as well.
Interesting. Tell me a little bit more about the disparity in the socioeconomics and how that plays a role in siblinghood.
From my perspective, both of my parents were factory workers. My mom didn't work until the number four child was born. She was a teenage mother, but I came from a two-parent household, as did one of my really close friends. But both her parents were college educated. Their interaction, the three of them, was not as cohesive. They had separate friends. They had separate bedrooms. So the closeness was not there that I saw with my siblings. When you have three sleeping in the same room, three that pretty much share clothes because we're all the same size. It's a small town versus her being from a larger town. They traveled, we didn't travel because there was too many of us and my parents couldn't afford it. So when I talk about my siblings, there's a lot of laughter and some frustration and giggling. But when she talks about her siblings, it's like a separateness. They're each individuals as opposed to a family unit. And that was a little surprising to me. I told her, I said, well, you know what? I could see where, like in looking at the three of them, I could see the dynamics of the older sister, the middle, and the younger. And it was the older and the younger that I interacted with most. But oddly enough, the younger seemed to be the stronger type personality, and the older was a little more mild mannered. I didn't see her at all as being the one in control, and it just seemed like the younger one was sort of driving everything. So it was different.
That's an interesting component that you bring up. Oftentimes, we sort of indirectly try to decipher ourselves outside of socioeconomic situations. And we sort of look at things because we're in that situation. That's our
Hmm.
normal.
That's
We
all we
don't
know.
we don't factor that in to why a certain personality is who they are coming to be. And so when I'm trying to form these patterns or narratives that may be similar on a universal standpoint, I think we have to be wise enough to factor in this social economic piece as it
Hmm.
pertains to how our siblings may have certain characteristics or personality traits. And I think about even the whole piece as the number one sibling, the first one born in the birth order. And are the roles assumed by that first person because maybe they feel they need to help out financially because they might be in not a good position to
Hmm.
where the parents or parent is bringing in enough money? Do they then feel the charge to say, I want to step up and help out my family? Or is that something that is spoken by the parents to say, hey, we need you to help out? And not just from a finance basis. I think about even as how they interact with other siblings. As you are on the top end of the birth order, how much of your role as an older sibling is assumed versus actually spoken and charged by your parents?
I think 75 to 80% is assumed.
Mm.
Because I do think, just kind of going back to the socioeconomic fact, when you're on the higher end, you have the opportunity to sort of explore different things and learn things about yourself. When you're on the lower end, you don't have access to different outside sources to help you determine who you are and define your strengths. They're more sort of intrinsic. You grow and develop in your particular environment. Those factors are heavily influenced by your environment and less so by outside factors. So I didn't get to learn different strengths or who I was outside of the house.
Mm.
As the older sibling, you're very sensitive to your parents. And I think it's, maybe not all, but majority of us, I think, have that desire to want to help. Just like when a new baby comes in, you want to go get the bottle. You want to be the big sibling. You want to be the helper. And I think intrinsically, most older siblings want to be the helper. Again, unless you go to preschool while the baby's in the house and you still get to focus on yourself and building out whoever you are to become. It's not that your parents stated, it's almost like it's understood. You just sort of fall into that.
It's just fascinating to me because, as you mentioned, through your journey of womanhood and adulthood, you're finding these revelations about your identity as it pertains to your relationship with your siblings. And so I'm wondering, as the revelations have unfolded, how have those affirmations or validations or things that maybe even are mirrors that say, oh, wow, this is something I'm now discovering, the self discoveries, how have those moments changed the way that you see yourself, even as a young Marilyn to and now an older Marilyn?
Yeah, it's so funny you say that because as a young Marilyn, I had so many insecurities, so many doubts, always needing the stroking and the atta girls and all that. I strived for that and wanting to please. I was a doer and I didn't want to tell anybody no. I wanted to keep everybody happy. But as a middle-aged Marilyn, I'm realizing that, you don't have to prove your worth. And the thing is, and I don't know why I felt that way, because I think people that are true to you, they value you what you bring, and they want no more than what you're able to give. So now I'm not as tense. I mean, I think I was so rigid growing up, just always feeling like I needed to be the one in control, had everything together. I needed to be there to help the parents if they needed anything. I needed to be in charge of the siblings and anything that our parents needed. Well, I don't. And I can still be in charge of some things, but not feel like I have to have total control. And I can engage the other siblings and ask their opinion. And it's nice to be able to recognize that now at middle age. And what I try to do is, okay, well, now that I've recognized it, for those that want to listen, for the two that want to listen, I share. And for the others, there will be an opportunity for me to share. I think they're in different stages of their life right now. Depending on where you are in your life, you may have challenges that overwhelm you and you're just not open to hearing some conversations. But what I've told myself is when the opportunity comes for those other two sisters, I will share, and hopefully it'll bring them some comfort and help them not struggle as much. Because I think as women, we do struggle a lot internally. And if we're not having these open, heart-to-heart conversations, we're going to continue to struggle.
Absolutely. And I appreciate you opening up your heart, Marilyn, and journeying us through your revelations of your own self discovery, your siblings' discovery and revelations of them, and the dynamic that plays a part within the two. And so I appreciate that. I hope that this does spark a conversation with siblings out there who are listening to this, even within themselves, with their siblings that they may be wanting to have that conversation with. But as you've mentioned so eloquently, that for everything there is a season. So maybe right now the conversation gets started within someone's own self first, that they start doing the inner work and recognizing some personality traits or some dynamics within themselves as it pertains to birth order, sibling, and their interactions with the parents and even their own brothers and sisters. And then maybe when that season avails itself, if it avails itself, that they then have those conversations externally with their siblings and begin to cultivate those relationships. So I appreciate you giving us the insights. This has been Marilyn Whitney Carter, and we thank you so much for joining us and on this episode of Siblinghood, of unpacking our relationships and discovering our identity. For more content and to download copies of my ebooks, go to simplelifeconversations.blog. That's simplelifeconversations.blog. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast channel to get the latest episode of Conversation Starters.